my name's Lindsay Levin. I'm from the UK, as you can probably hear, currently based in New York. And for the last 16, 17 years, I've been running an organization, a social enterprise called Leaders Quest. And I'm going to share a few stories about how that came about and the work that we do. And I'm going to begin in 2001, when I started the organization, with a little story from Ethiopia. So at the time, I was a businesswoman in the UK. I had 3 very small children, and I was very curious about the world. I'd studied economics, I was really interested in development, and I was invited with my husband to go with Oxfam to Ethiopia to see their work there. And we spent an extraordinary 10 days, beginning in a place called Delanta. I don't know, there's a few people here old enough to remember Band Aid, Live Aid. But Delanta was the part in Ethiopia that sparked that response to a major famine and had seen cyclical famines ever since. So we started out in this extraordinary ecosystem with people really surviving on the edge in an area of huge deforestation, long difficult political history, and an area of famine still today. And we ended our week in Addis Ababa with organizations working on mental disabilities and physical disabilities in very, very poor communities. And I had one of a number of moments that really kind of have helped shape my future whilst there in Addis Ababa. I was out in a slum community, and I came across a woman slightly on the edge of this slum, living in a small shack made of cardboard and bits of corrugated iron. And she was crouching down in front of her home with a little fire making bread. And she had a little child bundled up lying on the ground beside her. And with a translator, I sat down and I started to have a conversation with her. Her name was Hasia, and she told me about her life, which had been very, very difficult. She had 2 children, an 8-year-old boy, and her little daughter beside her, who was born with cerebral palsy 4 years previously. And when the daughter was born, very, very poor family. Her husband couldn't cope and he left, and Hasia was left here looking after this child. Now, I was a mother, as I said, little kids actually similar age. I came from a very different background. I had a perception of this huge gap, or series of gaps, between myself and this woman. And yet, as I sat there talking to her, I just kind of felt the gap disappear. And I felt myself sort of walk into this space. There's a lovely saying, you never meet a person without leaving something behind. And I often think about Hasia and the impression she left on me, which in some way meant I wanted to come here, for example, today and tell you a little bit about her story. And for me, it was just deep connection. It was, circumstantially, our lives appear very different. But in reality, of course, we're very much part of the same whole. And that experience, learning by being somewhere and meeting people in very different circumstances, caused me to found Leaders Quest as a social enterprise with the idea that if I could persuade people to come with me to different places, maybe in their own backyard or maybe on the other side of the planet, we would be changed by the process of meeting and engaging and spending time together. So I created an organization that does experiential learning. We call it Quests. We do that all over the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, but also closer to home, my original home here in the UK and Europe, and now I live in New York. We do a lot of work also in New York. And when we create these quests, we mix up spending time with business, with large companies, with small companies, with innovators, with entrepreneurs, with scientists, but also with leaders from civil society and communities and from government. And we go out and we see things and experience things and try to make mutual connections and experiences. To just bring a little bit of that to life, we do a lot of work with companies, bring corporate leaders, for example, to China, spend time in factories with 20,000 people making shoes, or 40,000 people making laptops, and think about the ecosystem that brings that together. The laptop I use made in this factory by this community of people who've come from all over China to do this work in a 12-second repeat all day long cycle time for my little bit of making a laptop. Not judgment, just trying to understand, how does this work? How do we all fit together? spending time in India in slum communities and understanding the extraordinary, radical affordability that people are creating in innovators, entrepreneurs, people starting businesses with totally different starting assumptions than might be true, for example, in my own community. So learning by engaging across different kinds of divides. And what we found, actually rather like my story with Hasia, is that we can people make level shift moves in terms of our insight and understanding. I think of it as knowing things that it's then impossible to unknow. You know something in a moment that takes you to a different place, and you can't undo that in a very wonderful way. So today, how the organization's evolved, we work a lot with corporations, we do a lot of work helping companies learn, but also a lot with non-profits and people from different walks of life. One of the reasons we work so much with business is because we believe, and I know this is an idea shared by people in this room, business is a huge force in the world, a huge driver of the future, and wields extraordinary power, and oftentimes business leaders don't really understand, in my view, none of us understand really, do we, the power that we wield, and what's the responsibility that comes with that if you're part of a global entity. How do you take that seriously, and how do you get educated? How do you learn? How do you bring knowledge and wisdom together to make better decisions? So we're very global. Again, I'll bring a couple of examples to life. We do a lot of work in the Middle East, particularly in Israel and Palestine. And when we'll sometimes, earlier this year, I brought together 30 leaders from different walks of life. Some were from non-profit, some were from business, to spend a week in Israel and Palestine. And it's a part of the world where everybody comes with all sorts of assumptions, and often with a great deal of certainty about what is right and wrong. And it's very challenging, I think in a wonderful way. It's kind of humbling. And so what, in my experience, happens in bringing people together in that sort of environment is that our own judgment and certainty gets challenged. And I knew that by the end of the week, in some way, everybody in that group would realize that we were not looking out a window, we were looking in the mirror. And this is just human beings doing the messy stuff that we do. And it's complicated, but actually the sort of getting under the surface and really connecting with people, especially when you think you don't agree with them, is just extraordinarily powerful. A lot of work also closer to home in the UK, and now I'll speak a little bit about working in my adopted country now, the US, and try to bring a couple of examples to life for you. So 3 weeks ago, I was in the city of Detroit with one of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley, household name for all of us, where we're trying to help those leaders think about the responsibility that Silicon Valley and major companies working there really have in the world, not by preaching to them, but just by taking them out to see things for themselves. And, again, by the end of a few days, there was this profound realization that here we were in a city, Detroit, that had been, some decades back, the richest, most innovative, most powerful city in the world, seat of global innovation. In 2013, it went bankrupt, and now it's just beginning to come back, actually in the most wonderful and extraordinary way. And the irony of that, or the metaphor really for Silicon Valley, was not lost on any one of those people. And it was a really powerful learning moment for them to think about, what went wrong in a place like, and what went wrong with the transition in something like the car industry, what went wrong in terms of arrogance and getting out of your bubble that we need to learn from in different kinds of environments. Another example, we're doing a lot of work currently in Appalachia. I know some of you heard from a wonderful speaker yesterday on that topic. We took earlier this year, together with Bill, sitting here in the front row, 35 global climate change leaders to coal country, actually to McDowell County, which voted over 90% for Trump in the primaries before we even got to the election. And we really listened to one another. We really engaged with one another. I tell you, for me, my first experience of going to McDowell in particular and to Appalachia, by the time I'd driven from the airport to this particular community, I understood in a visceral way why the Democrats had lost the election in the US. And it was just been the most extraordinary, humbling and really human learning journey, spending time in these extraordinary communities and learning with these people. So how how have we evolved and how are we evolving the work? One of the things that we've learned is that giving people, especially actually business people, but I'd say also probably people from academic backgrounds, a rationale as to why we should pay attention to this kind of learning is very helpful. And we've developed a narrative drawing on the wisdom and expertise of many other people that actually we're finding is very compelling for people. And the narrative goes like this. It says, you know, we live at a time of extraordinary change. We live in a time when the pace of change is accelerating. When, to go to some of the comments made earlier, we've seen extraordinary gains for humanity in terms of human well-being over the last 100 years. We're now 7+ billion people on the planet, extraordinary gains in terms of well-being. Many of them the fruits of human ingenuity and of science and of discovery. But we also, of course, have, with our imprint on this planet and on one another, there's a lot of negative externalities that have come about from all of that. We live at a time of incredible technological change, Moore's law, and that applies, as you will know better than me, across so many facets of life. And we can all, in some ways, feel this sort of speeding up of life. It feels stressful. Under the surface, for most of us, I think, the stress of the pace of waking up in the morning and automatically reaching out and picking up the phone and looking at the messages, it's actually quite overwhelming. And we find that in speaking to that stress, in speaking to that gap, if you like, we really connect with people. And I think of this accelerating change, much of it brought about through human cleverness, and the gap between that curve and the journey of our own wisdom, which appears not to be shooting up off the graph, you know, at a rate of knots. So I think of this gap between cleverness and wisdom, and the need to pay far more attention to the wisdom part of the balance. And so then we thought about, well, you know, what is this gap? And we talk about it as a leadership gap. I think in leadership terms, there's a tremendous focus on competence, on metrics, on planning, on scenarios, on budgeting, on strategy, but very little focus on consciousness, on awareness, on the relational part of life, on understanding ourselves and understanding others, on how we stay open. Again, many of the things that Ian was talking about. And so we've come to realize that our work actually is just a practical expression of how do we make these shift changes in our consciousness. And in speaking to this gap and the pressures and stress that people feel, we actually connect with, okay, yeah, this is something I want to do something about this. You know, this is uncomfortable. And so we can perhaps help people think about the journey from being reactive to being more creative, to seeing the world in an integral way, to recognizing our relationship and connectedness, which is so wonderful and so beautiful and really exquisite. It's what makes life precious. So why we want to invest in that kind of a journey of really, if you like, being human. And so today in our work, we mesh this experiential stuff. You can all do it. We all do it every day. Getting out, meeting, connecting, seeing for ourselves, listening, deeply listening, with workshops, processes, tools, to enable people to think more about purpose and where they sit in terms of personal purpose, to enable people to think about values and their own, if you like, true north, to think about the capacity to engage with others, to build compassion, to develop compassion for ourselves and also for others. And how do we stay open, and how do we stay curious, and how do we notice our own judgment? And it's a daily practice, of course, but it's also, I think, the journey that is life. And in developing awareness of that, in noticing my own judgment, in being able to, oh, I've done it again, you know, there I go again, I've done that thing again, then I have choice. Once I start to notice the habits and to notice the runaway mind, then I have a choice, and there's something I can do about it in terms of making change. One example I'll draw on is the work in climate change. We're doing quite a lot of work with leaders in the climate change space. And one of the reasons we set about that was that we were very struck by how depleted so many people are working in this space. There's a real sense of grief as we look about us and think about what's happening to our planet and to the people on it and to future generations. And so we've been doing work to bring together climate change leaders and give them experiences that I think are full of hope and the abundance of innovation and possibility that is everywhere, actually, if we look with the right lens. And one rather wonderful woman who came with us recently on a program described the the joy and the power and I guess the humility of realizing that there she was, intent upon persuading everybody else to change their behavior. And there was this moment for her of realizing, you know, actually the only person I can really change is me, and if I change myself, I will have more impact in terms of the very things that I'm most passionate about. So experiences that kind of give us that transformational moment. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that just under the surface, people really, really care about purpose. I suspect for all of you, it's right on the surface, it's right top of mind. I don't think there's probably many people from big corporations in the room, but let me speak to that world, because I spend a lot of time in that world, and I have great compassion for those who are trying to change business, who are trying to change the model which we're all kind of stuck with right now of shareholder return really dominating. It's very, very hard with the pressure of quarterly returns and activist investors and all the rest of it to change this game. So there are people out there who are kind of trying to build a bridge to the future whilst also walking across it, and we try to walk alongside those people. But, you know, even in some of the companies that we might feel most skeptical or cynical about, in my experience, just under the surface, and it takes maybe a day or a day and a half to get there, people really do care about purpose, and oftentimes we get kind of trapped in systems that it's very hard to break through in. A simple thing that we do in our practice is we give people silence. Again, I use the example of the Silicon Valley company from 3 weeks ago. We did things like spend 30 minutes in silence when nobody could use their electronic devices. People say, I have not done that for 10 years in my waking time. I have not for 10 years not looked at my messages. And the amount of insight that people gain in 30 minutes of silence is absolutely extraordinary. I kind of laugh, you know, we get people to come from all over the world to just be quiet and kind of listen to what our own intuition is telling us. And it's such a gift. So silence actually has become a very powerful piece of what we do. And in that silence opens up a space to imagine and to dream and to see that things are possible in ways that the everyday pressures, when we're very focused on them, you know, don't really allow. One more example that happened actually on my way here. I got a phone call from somebody to say another program we were running last week with a big financial services company in New York. And this woman from HR said to me, you know, there was a very senior man called James who was on your program last week, and he's unbelievably difficult, and he's, you know, renowned for being an appalling manager of people. And he started to chase me on Friday, and I thought, oh God, I just can't bear it. You know, what on earth's James got to say? And I tried to avoid him, and eventually he walked into my office and he said, that program was just extraordinary, and I have to apologize for the way I've treated you for the last 10 years. So, you know, it was just, now it's got to last, hasn't it? But, you know, those things happen. So just kind of in conclusion, and maybe this is very obvious, but why does this stuff matter? Well, the inner stuff, the inner game drives the outer game. The consciousness part, the feelings part, the way I feel about my colleagues, or, you know, how I wake up in the morning, or the challenges I'm dealing with, or, you know, the humility I might feel, or the whatever emotions, the anger, the fear, the stuff that goes through us, that drives how we turn up. And so focusing on this inner game, which is often not spoken about, partly because I think it's difficult and it's personal, it means I've got to do something about me, but also partly because it's very difficult to measure. Focusing, I think, on the inner game has the potential to have an extraordinary impact in the ways that all of you are working towards. And I know I'm talking to many practitioners who are really steeped in working on that inner game. But, you know, as I look out and I think about trying to help organizations change and communities change and families change and teams change and transform ourselves to a better place for the future, investing in that inner game, I think, is crucial. And, you know, if you take leadership, the space that we work in, individual leadership is hard enough. Trying to do it collectively, trying to do it as you all work in collaboratively and across organizations, how often it goes wrong, not because of the plans and the technicalities, it goes wrong because of human behavior. It goes wrong because my ego bumped into somebody else's ego and we fail to move forward. So what I'm passionately committed to is working with people on this inner game piece and bringing that more and more to life, and really the belief that in all these different spheres where we're trying to drive change and transformation, continually working with a sense of fun as well as joy, as well as I guess sometimes that horrible realization of there I did it again. Working on that inner game is actually fundamental, and we cannot go on to do these other things and try to change the world without really paying attention to the wisdom part of who we all are. And I'll just end by saying that in my experience, I'm very fortunate, I get to spend time in all sorts of corners of the world with extraordinary people in all sorts of circumstances. And whenever I get overwhelmed by the complexity of it all, or sometimes the painfulness of it all, you know, the sadness of spending time in some of the very, very poor communities, for example, where I spend time, I come back to the simplicity of it really is about, in my case, you know, how can I change who I am? How can I have a different kind of influence by the way that I turn up? And that's kind of a North Star, you know, to just come back to that. Gandhi was very wise in that beautiful phrase, be the change that you want to see in the world. And for me, that is certainly a guiding principle and a reminder whenever it all gets to be too much. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm thrilled to be here.